I had nothing to do with the creation of Dr. Gribbleflotz. It came as a surprise to me when he was brought to my attention. And then it underwent its own evolution, and that's partly what we're going to be discussing in this panel discussion. So with no further ado, I would like the two authors to explain exactly how did Gribbleflotz emerge into existence.
Well, it emerged into existence without any desire.
Yeah. I didn't introduce the two of you. You need to.
Well, my name's Rick Boatright, and back in 2000, late 2001, early 2002, Eric was working on the second novel with David Weber. They were working on 1633. And one night I got a phone call from this guy, and he says, "Hi, this is Eric Flint." And I went, "Sure." Because, no, I mean, out of the clear blue sky. And he asked me to help him and David with some technical background stuff that they wanted off of the bar, not in the forum on Bain's website, which I agreed to. And so that's how I got wrapped into writing material in the 1632 universe. I started writing technical backgrounds and quickly became part of the chemistry team, the firearms team, people writing articles about how things mechanically, physically worked in the 1632 universe. And that became my role as the background nonfiction guy. And the first Grantville Gazette had my white paper I wrote for Eric and David on radio. So that was what I was doing. And we had the first of the mini cons, the first convention of people interested in the 1632 universe in Mannington, West Virginia, in the town that became the model for Grantville. And people were sitting around, we were having lunch, and a conversation got started that the ladies in Grantville were going to be very unhappy because they were going to run out of baking powder, and these Southern women would be grossly unhappy if they were unable to make biscuits. Just was a problem. And Virginia DeMars looks over at me and she says, and Laura Runnels was there too. And and she says, "Well, surely someone can make baking powder." Yes, me, sorry. And the conversation went around. The chemistry people were busy, working on gunpowder improvements and chlorinating the water and whatever. They were busy. And so we had to come up, but Virginia was just insistent, someone can do it, surely there's some downtimer that's a competent lab tech or something. If he had a cheat sheet, he could do something, a recipe. And I was, just going, nah. And Laura pretty much went, nah. And then about a half an hour later, all of a sudden, this guy shows up in my head. And I started scribbling down the description that got posted eventually onto the bar. But, about this guy who was a competent lab tech and who was convinced that he was the world's greatest alchemist. And he was the great-grandson of the father of modern medicine, Paracelsus. He was above being a manufacturer. He wasn't going to make material for people to cook with. That wasn't his goal in life. He was somewhat bigger than life, kind of full of himself, but utterly rejected by the academics in town in terms of being, he was an alchemist, for God's sakes, at a time when alchemy was, well, not set aside, not belittled, but was on its way down. So I wrote out this character, and I intended it to be a one-shot. I intended it to be a joke. He was supposed to be a joke. And I posted it onto the bar. This is how we got the baking powder made. And I came up with a name, and his mother had named him Philip Theophrastus Gribbleflotz. Why Gribbleflotz? Because it sounded ridiculous, and I was making something up that was a joke. Philip, because why not? And Theophrastus, because that was one of the names of Paracelsus, and so he was named after his great-grandfather. So it all kind of went together like that. And then this idea of cheat sheets got going, and we added in that, they came to, after he had developed a mechanism for making baking powder, baking soda, they went to him and said, well, we're running out of aspirin. People need aspirin too. And so he said, well, yes, I could do it, but I don't want to. Oh, come on, Philip. What are you going to do? You can do it. So he said, $1 a pill. The most ridiculous price he could come up with. And he did. And they said, okay. So that was how, the first postings got on the bar. But they weren't stories, they were ideas. They were vignettes or something. They were not stories. They were just a description of what happens. And then Karen had this idea that there really could be a story, an actual story with characters. So, your turn.
Yeah, it wasn't actually me.
Karen, introduce yourself first.
Right. I'm Karen Offord, the lead author. I've been going back looking at my records. I'd say posts from the bar and from emails. And around 15th of July 2004 was when that discussion happened on the bar. And so Rick gave his description, and Karen Bergstall suggested that, there could be stories in this. And I just suggested that I would have a go, because I'd written I'd slashed a few stories. I had characters that I understood, characters that were talking to me. And so, Housewives of Grantville is where it starts. Except that Rick was looking at Methodists. The characters I was looking at are Catholic. As far as I'm concerned, there's no difference. And I suggested to Rick that I'd be willing to have a go at writing the story, starting with, I did think it was going to be baking powder, but Rick said, no, have to start with baking soda because that's the easier one. And that's sort of how we started. I got a description, a bit of backstory from Rick. We worked on that. And from the backstory, generate the character, some characterizations, the idea that he's not part of the academic community.
No.
Although over time, the way that works has been changed. Instead of some of the academic community like him, possibly because of the members of the academic department who don't like him. So there's an academic conflict.
Well, that and the fact that he's now one of the 5 or 6 richest men in Europe, you know, that of course has nothing to do with it.
Oh, this is before that, at the beginning. So, you know, I started working on the first story, Calling Dr. Phil. It's a take from Calling Dr. Kildare, I think, which is sort of dating me, although I don't think I ever actually watched it. Also, Dr. Phil from Oprah. Also, Dr. Phil, because I kept on misspelling Gribbleflotz. So I wanted an easy name to write with. So took the initial beginning that Rick had defined of the housewives upset about not having the biscuits. And that is where we started from with Calling Dr. Phil. So you got the housewives at a Sunday after church picnic or get together. The children are running around playing sports. The men folk are burning the meat on the barbecue. And the women or young mothers are sitting down, chatting. And somebody comes in and says, you know, this is the last of my baking powder, so, and they start talking. And within the group, you've got connections with other members of the Grantville community. So we've got Amy Kubik, who is, I think she's related to Greg Ferrara, who is the head of the chemistry department. And so the suggestion is that she gets a cheat sheet from Greg. That was Rick's original idea, but I ended up going with, is it Christine Prezi? Another of the chemistry teachers. So it's irrelevant which one they went to, but so I got the cheat sheet, we get started, then they have to find their alchemist.
So they have to find their lab tech. They approach the university and go, the university goes, you know.
In the beginning, started, you know, they think they're looking for an alchemist. They end up, you know, getting knocked back because the alchemists are not interested in making cooking powder. They eventually stumble across Dr. Gribbleflotz, and really they persuade him because he's short of money, the rent's due, various other reasons. He's financially distressed. This is when I put this story into the 1636, the Chronicles of Dr. Gribbleflotz, we refined what was happening to set up the scene a bit better. But Calling Dr. Phil was just a straight out one-off story. Didn't worry so much about the background. He's in Jenna. He's a sort of failed alchemist. And from there, that's the first story. We already had the background for making the baking powder. There's a need for that. But the real story for the second one was the aspirin, or as they were called, the little blue pills of happiness.
because of course, Dr. Phil, while he made aspirin pills, was not about to leave them white, because white is a cold and off-putting color. And so if you want to make a pill that will calm the heat of pain for headaches and for arthritis and stuff, you wouldn't make a white pill. That would be silly. So Dr. Phil has, you know, a variety of chemistry available to him, and so he uses a blue dye. What's
Whoa,
jeans? Huh?
whoa,
No. What's blue jeans?
denim.
Right. The word's not there. It doesn't matter. He uses a blue dye, and so he's marketing his aspirins are blue, and they come in this little milk casein cast container that's also blue, and so they're Dr. Phil's little blue pills of happiness, because we were able to play on the fact that Viagra is blue.
That spilled over into other storylines, because I can't remember if it was, might have been me, might have been Andrew Dennis. I'm not sure who, but we picked it up in the Stone family storyline, which we have a panel on elsewhere in the convention. And because Tom Stone is the one who actually develops modern uptime medicine, as well as dyes and chemistry and stuff that makes him very wealthy in the 17th century. And one of the things he does is make some medicines, including he has his own line of aspirin, and it drives him absolutely nuts that Dr. Phil's little blue pills outsell his properly white aspirin by a country mile, because of 17th century attitudes about it. They're blue. You know, it makes sense to 17, yeah, okay, blue is a color of serenity, makes sense. And it absolutely drives Tom Stone nuts that there's this superstitious, anyway, I'm not going to
alchemist.
Yeah, exactly. And Tom tends to get frustrated by aspects of the 17th century, let's put it that way. And his three sons, especially the middle one, Ron, who winds up actually being the one who's running the business, gets kind of frustrated with him, because it's like, just be practical about it, will you, Dad? So he finally, on his own, just quietly tells his people to start dyeing their own pills blue, because, that's the exception.
Because that's the color aspirin should be, sure. Of course.
Exactly. Anyway, I'm sorry,
No, it's okay.
But go ahead.
Because that sets up a much later thing that we'll be talking about in a little while. But so those two things start the money flowing in to Gribbleflotz Industries, right? And Karen came up with a character. Dr. Philip wants to, stay in his lab and play with his chemicals and other stuff in his lab. And, he doesn't want to run a business. And in the process of making baking soda and the process of making aspirin, he can't do all that physically as the demand goes up and up. So he has to hire people to actually run the processes of producing those things. And he has to hire people because, of course, producing the baking soda requires that he have someone doing daily collections, because he has cornered the market on the output from the urinals in all of the bars in Jena and Grantville. Because early on, the process of making baking soda requires ammonia. And early on, the only real source of ammonia they have is urine. So, which they ferment and anyway. So we don't talk about that much when we're talking about baking soda. But And I learned something when we were doing that, because I thought it would be way better for him to just make a deal with the guy that runs the stables in Jena. And it turns out that horse urine has almost no ammonia in it compared to human urine. There's just not that much nitrogen in horse urine. So, oops, who knew? Fortunately, we had animal people in the 1632 community. She's gone. I miss her a lot. Anyway, so Phil had somebody had to go around to all the bars and collect the barrel, swap out the barrels, and get the fresh barrel of urine every day. But the point is, he had lots of employees, and he had to train them and pay them. And okay, Karen, why does Phil call his employees laborants?
Why not? In the
Why
definition.
not? Okay, I was afraid you were going to say that.
Well, it does sort of go quite nice with the idea of lab rats, though.
Okay. So anyway, so Phil has more and more employees that he's trained very carefully to make aspirin and to make baking soda, but he really needs a business manager. And they find him one. His investors find him one. The Kubiaks find him one. He ends up with this gal. What's her first name, Karen?
Ursula? Ursula?
No, Frau Mittelhaus.
Yeah. Ursula Mittelhausen.
I'm sorry?
Ursula Mittelhausen.
Ah, okay. So she becomes the business manager and frees Dr. Phil to spend his days dribbling this into that.
Just see what happens.
Yeah, see what happens. And in one of the stories, there's a line where he goes, yes, this is the 137th thing that I've added to formaldehyde or something like that. You know, it just, anyway. But that's where the stories got started. That's where they started building on. And each of the stories then originally had a bit of chemistry, had a bit of tech and chemistry that it was going to be built around. The story would build around. And the way that the combination of the technology from me and the people from Karen worked, you know, we ended up with this really very fun character who, you know, from starting off as if I'd had any idea that this guy was going to be an ongoing concern in the 1632 universe, I would never have come up with Gribbleflotz. But, well, we're stuck with that now.
It works.
Yeah, it's yeah, genealogists would be driven crazy by that name if they try to track down a Gribbleflotz line in Central Europe.
Oh, well, we settled that. There isn't one because his father was not exactly a ne'er-do-well, but he was living under an assumed name. And so Gribbleflotz was a made-up name made up by Phil's father.
All right.
So, and
that
Phil's
pushes the mystery back a step, but you'd still have to ask, why did he come up with that instead of just using the pseudonym?
He wasn't very good at making up names.
Yeah, I know, I guess so.
So, anyway, so over the course of the next lot of years, Karen and I wrote a bunch of Gribbleflotz stories. What, Karen, there were 7 or 8?
Something like that.
Something like that.
Usually something happened.
Yeah.
When did the idea and come up and who originated it, might have been me, but I don't remember doing it, to take these and rework them and turn them into a novel, which is what you finally wound up doing.
Oh, that was your fault.
Yeah,
Huh?
definitely.
That was your fault, Eric.
Me?
Yeah. You approached us and you said that Bain had an open slot, and that if we could get them a manuscript by this date, that there was a possibility we could have a Gribbleflotz book. And you just you kind of said it to us as a challenge, and so Karen, with my assistant, started building the backstory, and we started this thing off. So the first third of the book is all new. The middle third was kind of the existing story stitched together, and then the last third was all new. And the first part started off with the day that Phil's mother dropped him off at the front door of the company where he was going to do his apprenticeship. And Phil's mother is not a nice woman. Matter of fact, Phil's mother is creepy. And she literally just dropped him off at the front door and walked away before he even got inside.
How old was he at the time?
Would have been about 12, I think.
12.
Yeah, okay, 12. All right. Okay.
12. Yeah, it was creepy. Because she just walked away. She was a serial widow. She had married gentleman after gentleman who had passed away, but she was getting older, and her last husband had passed away, who was a pharmacist, an apothecary, and he had passed away, and the last thing that she needed in order to find another husband was a 12-year-old boy hanging around. So she looked around, found some place that she could find for him as an apprenticeship, dumped him off, and walked away so she could start searching for another husband. Just not a nice lady. So Phil was standing there, and the door opens, and his life in chemistry begins.
He had sort of learnt stuff at the hands of his stepfather. And he probably absorbed, I suggest that he's absorbed stuff that he really shouldn't have been exposed to.
Yeah, because his stepfather, his mother's most recent husband, was an apothecary. And so Phil wasn't hanging out with his mom. She wasn't doing that. So he spent his whole day, every day from the time he was about 6, hanging out with this stepfather. And so he was exposed to all of the things that an apothecary does. And he was a responsible little twit, and so his stepfather had him doing things that no 7 or 8-year-old would logically be doing, messing with acids or making drugs or treating whatever, or watching him treat whatever. And it's just the way it went, So he had background that he probably shouldn't have had, but it helped make him who he is.
What years were this that you started turning it into a novel? Remind me.
2014? I had handed in by September 2015, but I was going to Russia that year.
Yeah, that was the year you went to Russia. I remember that.
Right. So it was the year. It was the year before that.
Yeah, sometime 2014.
That the novel got.
I'd forgotten how this thing got started. Well, the background of that is that starting I can't remember the year. The first book we did was by Virginia de Marce. It was called 1635, The Tangled Web. And what happened was that by then Jim Bain had passed away, and Tony Weisskopf was now the new publisher of Bain Books. And I talked with Tony, and up until then, the only novels written in the series were ones where I was either the author or the co-author, one of the others. And what I proposed to her was that Bain start producing some, they'd be trade paperbacks, not hardcovers, but my name wouldn't be on the cover. It would, these, I would help people, but I wouldn't be doing enough to warrant putting my name on the cover. And these would be books by other people who had been active in the series. Now, Virginia had by then co-authored two at least books with me, and those would have been The Ram Rebellion and 1634, The Bavarian Crisis. And I can't remember if we'd done 1635, The Driessen Incident by then either. But so she was known as a co-author of mine, but Tony agreed, and so we produced this volume of Virginia's writings called The Tangled Web. And it did quite well. I mean, the sales were very good. And so, given that success, Tony agreed to keep, let's try again. So the next book we produced was by Ivor Cooper, and it was a combination of two separate braided novels in the same volume, one of which, these were based on stories that he was had written for the Gazette that he then reworked, much the way you guys did the middle part of the Chronicles of Dr. Gribbleflotz. And one story dealt with the Japanese starting to colonize the West Coast, and the other took place in northern South America, in the Spanish Main. And that was published as 1636, The Seas of Fortune, and it did quite well. And so we decided to keep going. And I think Gribbleflotz, if I recall correctly, it was either the third or the fourth of these books.
Third, I think.
I think it was the third, and then the fourth was the one by Annette Peterson, The Wars for the Rhine. And that's where I would have, I don't remember this, but I'm reconstructing it. That must have been when I came to you guys and said, okay, I talked to Tony. There's a slot open for a trade paperback, but it's coming up fairly soon, so you got to get it done pretty quickly. And what I remember when I read the manuscript, the thing that struck me about the way you'd done it was that up until then, the Gribbleflotz in the Gazette stories, he'd been kind of a comic figure. I mean, he was, there was something a bit ridiculous about him. He was kind of this pretentious alchemist who was going to educate these ignorant Americans that this foolish notion they had of chemistry was all wrong, and that he was going to try to educate them on the correct approach embodied in alchemy. And he just would wind up stumbling into one incredibly lucrative money-making proposition after another. Started with the baking soda, and then the aspirin, and then went on from there.
Right. But of course, he didn't make baking soda. That was beneath his dignity. He was Gribbleflotz Sol Air.
Yeah, right. That's exactly what you call it.
Right. Yeah. Which is the salt of fixed air. Carbon dioxide, and he didn't make aspirin again. That's beneath him. But he made sal vin betula, the salt of the wine of the willow. So yeah.
Yeah. The thing that struck me, though, when I read the manuscript, and by the way, for the audience, the book we're talking about is called 1636, The Chronicles of Dr. Gribbleflotz, and it's the first actual full book produced that's all Gribbleflotz, and it's essentially a novel by then. It does have parts of it are forged out of earlier stories, but Most of it's actually new material, and even the part that
At
appeared
least
early.
2/3, maybe a little more.
Huh?
At least 2/3, maybe a
Yeah,
little.
maybe more. Well, and even the part that goes back to the stories was reworked. But what struck me about it was that he was really no longer ridiculous in the story. I mean, he was a much more serious character, and one that I don't know. I certainly wouldn't describe him as likable, although he's not unlikable. I mean, he's not a bad guy at all. But he's somebody you have to take a lot more seriously. That's what struck me. And he's
Well,
somebody who actually has a history. He's got a life, and he's no longer simply a figure of fun at all.
you have to answer, we had to answer some questions. First question we had to answer was, this guy is a superb technician.
Mhm.
He's a superb lab process guy. He's he's capable of making food additives and drugs in a 1630s room. How did that happen? Where did this ability to do incredibly detailed, precise lab processes come from? So there's one question for you. Then the second question is, he hires these people and develops the processes for them and trains them and gets them to making the baking soda, making the aspirin, making the whatever. And he obviously is enough of a solid person, not a fool, not a blowhard, not a yelling, screaming guy, because he's getting these people that he hires, his laborants, to produce, viable medicines and food additives in the 1600s, and he produces all this loyalty, and where did the loyalty come from? Where does that management that produces this intense loyalty appear from? And we had Karen, the massively misordered ore was a story before the book, right? Where he got the wagon load instead of a couple of kilos.
Yeah. Dr. Phil Zinken's a bundle, I think.
Right. He was making zinc, and he wanted a couple of kilos of zinc ore, and ended up getting a couple of wagon loads. And his staff and his employees dealt with it, covered for it, and made it come out okay. And so you have to wonder, where did that kind of loyalty come from? And so Phil has these elements that are humorous, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be Phil. But he's got these real solid bits of the kind of an severely honest, hardworking guy that produces this intense loyalty in his employees. And all of that existed in the individual little stories before the novel. So when the novel was written, we had to explain those. There had to be a reason for them in his background.
Mhm.
We also had to, there were a number of other little things that had to be explained, like, why does he speak English? And some other things. And so those questions drove the first third of the book, because we had to answer those. But yeah, so you're left with a guy who is a far more complex character than just the guy who goes around town wearing turquoise and international orange brocade jackets and bright green socks, and has cowboy boots with I don't know what with very brightly dyed leathers, forming his cowboy boots with heels, and that's his personality. He's an outgoing guy, and in that sense, he's loud visually, but underneath all that, he's a hardworking, extremely accurate, precise, honest, fair person. So there you are.
He's actually, I don't know, he's not exactly likable, but he's a rather admirable character in all kinds of ways. That's what struck me in the course of reading. I was surprised when I read your manuscript, because I was expecting it to be more like the stories were. And as I read it, I realized this actually makes for a more substantial story basis, because it's hard to carry. I'm sorry?
It's really hard to write 100,000 words about Bozo the Clown.
Yeah, exactly. And Gribbleflotz is no longer anywhere close to Bozo the Clown. And providing the backstory, which I hadn't even realized you guys were planning to do, that helped a lot too, because it does, because what happens is you wind up going back quite a bit earlier than the Ring of Fire, than the May 1631 appearance of Granville in the 17th century. And so you get a lot more of his back.
Early 1620s.
Yeah, it goes back quite a ways. If you could just summarize quickly what happens in the Chronicles of Dr. Gribbleflotz, and the reason I'm asking is I mostly want to use that as a basis to go on to talk about the next book that's coming out, which has now been, the manuscripts are completed, and Bain Book has bought it. There's contract, the whole shot. So there's going to be a sequel. So
the first third of the book is a series of stories, of vignettes, of bits and pieces that take Phil from age 12 up through the Ring of Fire. And the second third of the story is those Dr. Phil stories that were printed in the Gazette that tell of his involvement with the Uptimers. And then the third part of the book is where this now established man, who is now a prominent figure, has basically two things happen to him. The first is that, well, three things, whatever. The first thing that happens is that he becomes fascinated with the process of Kirlian photography, photographing auras. Okay? But unbeknownst to him, one of his employees takes that technology and goes out and starts training other people to take photographs of people's auras. And they're using the photographs of the auras to diagnose, people's oral well-being and help them balance their aura, okay? And Phil pretty much establishes pretty quickly through some experimentation that that's just BS. But the problem is he can't, if he comes out and says that in public, if he says, well, that's just BS, that's all ridiculous, he's the one who started it, and he'll be at fault. So through a number of, Phil falls into mud puddles and comes up with handfuls of diamonds. That's just the way he is. And so through a series of things, Phil ends up being the president of the Society of Kirlian Investigators, even though he doesn't believe in it. And he becomes the personal alchemist and Curlian investigator for the King of Bohemia and moves to Prague with Wallenstein. And at the end of the novel, then, Phil encounters Tom Stone, and Tom does a very bad thing and basically plays a joke on Phil and does that he and George Munsell from Grantville do a psychic surgery on Phil and make up a bunch of funny words and he comes up and Phil does they come up with a costume for the oral investigator psychic surgery people, and suddenly they're all wearing turbans and robes. It's just, and it's that Tom Stone needs to get in to see the King of Bohemia, do some medical stuff, and figures that he's got to get around Phil because he thinks Phil is just an alchemist.
So,
and that's kind of where we leave off the end of book one. Also, by the way, during that time, Phil falls in love, gets married, has a wife, and becomes one of the 5 richest men in Europe. So that's where book one leaves off.
All right. Now, so what happens then we were starting to run short of time, but if you could give us a sketch of what's going to be happening in the sequel.
Well,
which, by the way, the title of which is Dr. Gribbleflotz and the Soul of Stoner. So explain the title to begin with.
Well, so title's real simple. Phil finds out that he was befuddled by Stone, right? I mean,
yeah.
And Phil's angry, and Stone's going, well, of course I did, because after all, he's an alchemist. And so, that conflict has to be resolved. I mean, that can't go on. So that's theme number one, which really, Karen, 2/3 of book two, it threads its way through all of the things going on.
yeah.
Or really all the way to the end.
Yeah, sort of right through to the end. You get questions about what is actually the soul of Stoner when you get to the end. But we started with the premise. Philip somehow discovers that he's been made a fool of. He wants to know why. Dr. Stone has escaped to Padua in Italy, or the Republic of Venice, so we can't ask him there. So we have to send Dr. Phil to Venice so that he can confront Dr. Stone. And everything grows from that basic premise.
Yeah.
We have to get him, Phil has to discover, and then he has to go to Venice. So I pulled out a reason why he could go to Venice. He was going to perform surgery on the Doge.
And Karen comes up with the absolutely ickiest thing that we could possibly use as a tech basis for a 1632 novel. I mean, really, this was, yeah, even when I was writing the Science of article to go with the novel, I just reached the limit of what I could do in a family forum, because Karen decides that what he's going to do is include the classic method for the treatment of bladder stones by inserting a long mechanical instrument through the urethra and crushing the stones. I'm not going to explain that any further. If you don't get it, I have pictures that you can see in, look up lithotrite. And really, that's all I'm going to say.
It's a simple, doable piece of surgery.
You bet.
Something that
Okay,
Dr. Phil could do.
We're just very short of, we're running out of time. We're going to have just a few more minutes, but what
It's a
all right,
Zoom
I got
meeting.
no way of turning that thing off. One of the things I find kind of fascinating is that this gives you a kind of glimpse of, the way the 1632 series sort of works. There's a main line to the series, which are novels that I write either by myself, most of them, or two of them I've written with David Weber. I will be writing one in the future with Chuck Gannon, and I'll probably be writing another one now, it looks like, with Robert Waters. But that sort of follows the four main characters in a series that appear in 1632, the first book: Mike Stearns, Rebecca Bramanel, Gretchen Richter, and Jeff Higgins. And most of the major political and military developments happen in those mainline books. But around that, a whole panoply of storylines has emerged and developed, some of which I originate and develop, but others of which originate from other people, and they just go off. And then what I try to do, as much as possible, is see how I could weave them back into the overall series. And I've just been fascinated to watch how the Gribbleflotz thing has unfolded, particularly when in this second novel, the one that's coming out, you have the encounter with Tom Stone, because the Stone family, who were originally introduced into the series in the very first anthology, Ring of Fire by Mercedes Lackey, they've gone on through a huge evolution. And we have a panel in this very convention called The Amazing Stone Family, where both Tom Stone and his three sons all go and have their own separate adventures and are the subject of several novels in their own right. And it makes for really interesting storytelling. Let's put it that way. I know that some readers get frustrated by the complexity of it, and I understand that, and I'm sympathetic, but it's also part of the nature of the series itself. It's just inherent in the way it's designed, that these storylines will interweave in and out, and you never really quite know. I deliberately don't try to plan the series more than about a year series time ahead of time, because I want to be surprised myself, because I've always been worried that the series would start getting stale. But this was one way to keep that from happening, is that I don't even know quite where it's going at any one time. Anyhow.
Yeah, how would you have predicted that the Japanese would set up a colony in San
No, that was Ivor's idea. Yeah, no, that was Ivor's idea, and he came to me with it, and I said, I like that. That's, a lot of these ideas aren't mine. I mean, somebody else comes up with it, and there are a few that I put the kibosh on just because for one reason or another that just won't work, but not very many. I mean, I usually like to it challenges me to figure out a way to make the series incorporate that into it, rather than me saying, no, this is not the way I'm going. And I think it's helped keep the whole series. I mean, it's been going for 20 years now, and there's no sign it's, the Granville Gazette magazine is, to the best of my knowledge, the only successful professional magazine devoted to a series that is entirely literary. There have been magazines devoted to series before that have been successful, but they've always been anchored by some big media property, like, Star Wars or or for some years there was a magazine called The Man from U.N.C.L.E., something like that, or Doctor Who, whatever. But the 1632 series has been a literary series from the very beginning, and that's all it is. Perfectly
Well-
willing to change that if the opportunity comes up, but that's the way it is. And it's still been able to sustain a professional magazine for 13 years, which is longer than most science fiction magazines ever survived. So,
Well, we promised that book 2 has surprises in it, you know, that we haven't had an opportunity to mention at all. But there are some true evil people in this book, and these truly evil people get their comeuppance in various ways, from those who failed to survive and those who encounter officialdom. But there are surprises coming. And the one word hint at this point would be, if you're curious about a character that one of the bad guys, it would be enough to say, Peter Popoff, and just leave it there.
well, all right. We're just about out of time. So, Karen, do you have anything you'd like to add before we close?
No, I'm okay.
All right. Well, then, listen, there is going to be an autographing session right following this. So if you'd like to, the first novel is out and is available. That's the Chronicles of Dr. Gribbleflotz. So we will be selling it if you'd like to get a copy, and these two authors will be able to autograph it for you. So thank you very much for coming, and look forward to seeing you in other panels.